In my top 10 photography tips tutorial, I mentioned in tip number 2 that shutter, aperture, and ISO were extremely important things to know. I also said that in the very near future, I would do a tutorial on those 3 things. Well, the future is now. Hi, I'm Ray Scott, and welcome to Visual Art Photography Tutorials. So we're talking shutter, aperture, and ISO today. Now, the first thing you have to know about all of those things, those 3 things, is that they all let in light. They all let light into your camera, except they all do it differently and for different reasons. So we're going to start with the shutter. Now, this can be a very complicated thing to explain because the shutter is a very complicated thing, but we're going to keep it really, really simple to start with, okay? So what you have to know about the shutter is, yes, it lets in light, but how does it do it? Well, it's a mechanism that moves across your camera like a curtain, and it moves at different speeds. If it moves slowly, it lets in more light. It's open for a longer period of time. If the shutter is at a very fast speed, it's very quick. The curtain opens very quickly, just like maybe 1/2000th of a second. It lets in less light, but it also stops action. So let's say you're out in a field and the grass is moving in a high wind and you want to stop the grass from moving. Use a high shutter speed. If you want the grass to look like it's very silky and smooth, use a slow shutter speed. What's fast, what's slow? You know something? It depends on what you're shooting. But shutter speeds typically go from, 30 seconds, a second, 1/30th of a second, 1/60th of a second, 125, 1/250, 1/500th of a second, and so on. And each time it goes up like that, each time it doubles, it lets in half the light. So let's go to the computer and see what faster and slower shutter speeds look like. So here we are with those pesky little shutter speeds. Now there are a lot more shutter speeds available than what you see here. For every number that you see here, there are lots of different shutter speeds in between. But not too long ago, when most cameras had shutter dials on top, there was only so much room for so many different shutter speeds. So these were the typical ones. Actually, they usually went up to about 1,000 back then, maybe a 2,000th, and then you had all these down to maybe a half a second or a second, things like that. And those were your shutter speeds that you had on the dial on your camera. Now, of course, in the digital age with the electronics that we have, you have shutter speeds here. These are the typical classic shutter speeds, but there are lots of different speeds in between. For instance, between a 30th of a second and a 60th of a second, you have a 40th and a 50th. So there are a lot of different options, but even if you had just these, it would probably be plenty for you. Okay, so those are your shutter speeds. This bulb down here, if you're not familiar with that, cameras have a bulb setting, and when you have the bulb setting on your camera set, you can leave your shutter open an infinite amount of time. Okay, but that's for something else, usually used for nighttime photography, astrophotography, that kind of thing. Okay, let's take a look at what shutter speeds can do. Now here's that shot I was talking to you about your moving grass, and it's very, very windy here, but you don't know it because I've used 1/500th of a second to stop most of the action. So most of the blades of grass are pretty good. They're pretty clear. There was a lot of wind going on. This one, same thing, except it was taken at half a second. So look at all the motion. You can really see the grass moving. It gives you that feeling of motion. And you can use that as an effect. Say you're shooting a field of wildflowers, and you don't actually want them to be in focus. You want them to be a massive different color, almost look like an ocean of moving color. Well, you can use a slow shutter speed and get that effect. Again, with the shutter speeds, this car is traveling by at about 40 to 50 kilometers per hour, somewhere around 30, 35 miles per hour. And I shot this at 1/1000th of a second, and it stops it pretty well. Another car passed by, and that's at 1/25th of a second. So it's blurry, okay? And if you go even slower, look at that. And it's not this car that's being shot. It's a car in front of it, but it's almost invisible, actually. And you see these beautiful streaks. And, you know, if you use this kind of effect at night, you see those beautiful, everybody's got their lights on, the tail lights and so on. You see the long streaks of red and so on and so forth. And you can leave your camera open for many seconds, or even put it on that bulb setting that I was talking about. And you can have all kinds of streaks going on absolutely everywhere. Okay, so that's the shutter speed. You leave the shutter open and you can get some pretty cool effects. Stop the action. Half a second, you get the motion. Okay, so that should give you a little bit of an idea of what the shutter is all about. Now, how about the aperture? Well, the aperture is in your lens, okay? That's the opening in your lens, and it opens and it closes down. Now, typically, what they would call a wide open aperture would be something like this, okay? It's a wide open aperture. And then it can get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, when it's wide open, typically, let's say it's f2 or f2.8, something like that. It'd be like this, maybe f4, whatever. And then it closes down, f5.6, f8, f11, f16, f22. So, as you can probably imagine, the smaller the aperture is getting, the less light is coming into your camera. So why would you use f4, which is wide open, or f22, which is very small? Well, when you use a large aperture, like this, like f4, your depth of field is not very deep. In other words, you can take a picture of something, and then in the background, it's blurry and out of focus. If you're using something like f22, with the very small opening, the depth of field is great. You can take a picture of something up close, and in the background, it's pretty clear. Let's go to the computer and take a look at what Aperture does. All right, so I've made a little diagram for you here in terms of the apertures. Now, the funny thing about the aperture is that the larger the aperture, say at f4, the smaller the number is. Everything's kind of in reverse, so you have to get your head around that first of all. In other words, large aperture, small number. If you look at f22, that's a small aperture, but it's a big number. Okay, so you have to just remember that when the aperture gets smaller, the number gets larger, and in reverse. Okay, so just be aware of that. At f4, your aperture here is pretty wide open. It's pretty large. And it starts to get smaller at f5.6 and so on, f8, f11, f16, f22. All right? So you'll recall that if you have a wide open aperture, say at f4, if you focus on something in the foreground, the background will be most likely rather blurry. It may be the effect you want. As you go down and make your apertures smaller, then you get more depth of field, and what you have in the foreground is sharp, and what you have in the background is a little more clear as well. And if, depending on what kind of lens you're using and so on and so forth, it can be clear from front to back. Here's my first example today using an aperture of f4. Just some plants starting to grow this spring in the foreground. Now in the background, you know that that's a fence. You can see it, but it's pretty blurry. That's at f4. Now, if you look at it at f16, it's not clear because it's really quite far away, that fence, but you get a better idea of what it is. It's a lot more clear at f16 than it was at f4. Meanwhile, of course, everything in the front is the way you want it. Here's another example. Okay, here's an orchid, and I apologize. I mean, these are not great images. They're just being used for demonstration purposes. Now, you have your orchid in the front, and it's pretty clear. This is shot at f4. Now, in the background, what is that? It's pretty blurry. It's an orchid, actually. It's another orchid. You get a little bit of a better idea of what it is at f8. It's a little bit better. And then at f16, it's not clear, but you know it's another flower in the background. Okay, now, if I'd wanted this to be a little bit more clear in the background, what I would have done is I would have taken the camera a little further away from this plant. I would have moved further back, and then this would have been clear, and this would have been even more clear. But these are other techniques that you can use. And as you learn aperture, you play with your camera, and you start to find out things. But f4, f8, f16. Okay, so I think you have a pretty good idea of what the aperture does. Let's take a look at ISO. And again, ISO lets in light. But the ISO, it's kind of a throwback to when we used to use film. In the film days, you had film and it was rated with a different ISO. A very slow film, like 50, ISO 50 or ISO 100, let in a lot less light than something like, say, ISO 800 or ISO 1000. So why would you have used different film? Well, when you used a slow film, typically it was a lot clearer, it was a lot smoother. And when you used very fast film, like even ISO 400 or 800 or 1000, these films were kind of grainy. That was the makeup of these films, but they let in a lot of light. If you were doing some night photography or things like that, often you used a faster film. It was a bit of a trade-off. Well, the same principle kind of applies today in the digital world, but not quite as much, because camera sensors are amazing. They're absolutely amazing. So anyway, as ISO pertains to digital photography today, it allows certain amounts of light to hit your sensor. It boosts or doesn't boost the sensitivity of your sensor. So in other words, if you're using your ISO at, say, 100, it means that your sensor is not picking up as much light as it would be picking up, say, at ISO 1000. Now, what's happening with cameras today is they don't really work the way film worked. You can take a picture at ISO 100 and it will be clear and smooth and beautiful. And you can set most cameras to ISO 1000 and they're still taking beautiful, clear, smooth pictures because the sensors are that good. They have great dynamic range now in these cameras, and that allows you to bump up your ISO at will. My camera, the Canon 6D, is great. It has very little what they call digital noise. You can set the ISO to 1600 and it still takes great, smooth, ungrainy pictures. So it's a little less crucial now. I still usually use my ISO between 100 and 400, but I have no qualms about setting it to something a little bit higher if I need to. So ISO, that's basically the sensitivity of the sensor, how much sensitivity you're allowing your sensor to have. Less at 100, more at something higher. And it goes on like that. So now, how is everything related? Well, you have your shutter, you have your aperture and your ISO. They all let in light. And depending on what you want to do, if you want to stop action in sports, you make sure you have a fast shutter speed. If you're taking a landscape picture and you want everything to be clear and in focus from the front to the back, you'll use a small aperture so you can have a lot of depth of field. ISO. Let's say you're out at night. You're shooting and you didn't bring your tripod. Shame on you, but anyway, you didn't bring your tripod. You're walking the streets and it's getting dark. And you need to have more light come into your camera because you already want pretty good depth of field. Let's say you're setting your camera at f11. You can't have your shutter speed too slow, let's say, because you don't want things to be blurry. So what do? You bump up your ISO. Instead of shooting at maybe ISO 200, you shoot at ISO 1600. And all of a sudden you're getting a faster shutter speed and you're still getting your depth of field. They're all related. And the best way to really learn how ISO, aperture, and shutter speed are related and how they work together is to get your camera and play with them in different lighting situations and in different environments and see how each of them work together. A lot of power there. Well, I hope that helped. I'm Ray Scott, reminding you, it's not what you see, it's how you see it. I'll see you soon.